Welcome, everybody. My name is Amanda Robinson. I'm one of the co-organizers of the African Politics Conference Group. And we're here today to discuss a paper by Eugenia Anderson. So Eugenia is a PhD candidate at the Department of History and Political Studies at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. We also have two really excellent discussants, so I'm very appreciative for joining us today. We have Dr. Emmanuel Asiedu-Acquah, who's an assistant professor of international and global studies at Sewanee. His research focuses on youth culture and popular politics, students and nationalism, and mass media and development in Ghana and the broader West African region. Dr. Kristin Michelitch is an assistant professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. Her research is at the intersection of politics and development, with a particular emphasis on democratic processes and intergroup inequalities. So thank you to both of you for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your comments on Eugenia's paper. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everybody that the meeting is being recorded and it's going to be posted. And we'll take an hour. We'll stick right to the time, so we'll finish within the hour. I wanted to also give you a general sense of what the schedule is going to look like. So in just a few moments, I'm going to turn things over to Eugenia, just so that she can introduce the paper very briefly. After that, we'll have comments from Dr. Asiedu-Acquah for about 10 minutes, followed by Dr. Michelitch. And then we'll give Eugenia a chance to respond to those comments if she wants. And then we'll take questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask you guys, if you have questions, when we get to that point in the session, to please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, and I'll call on people to ask questions in the order that you've raised your hands. You can also put questions in the chat box if you'd like, and I can ask those questions at the end if there's time, after we've gone through the raised hand list. The last thing I'd like to ask you to do is to please mute your microphones if you're not actively speaking. And with that, I will hand it over to Eugenia to tell us a little bit about the paper that you've all hopefully read. Eugenia?
Sure. Thank you so much, Emmanuel and Kristin, for agreeing to be discussants for this paper. This paper is on gender, student activism, and social change in Ghana. So in summary, I'm looking at the contribution of university students, male and female university students, towards social change in Ghana, especially looking at the period from 1960 to 2008. So first of all, I define student activism as all manner of activities by male and female university students, both formal and informal, violent and non-violent, directed at themselves, institutional authorities, and government, as well as the international status quo, to effect a desired change. And the focus of this work is to do a gender analysis of student activism, because going through literature, I realized that there are several works on student activism. However, the concept of student activism has been shaped to look masculine, in the sense that the roles that male students usually played and male students centered activities were most of the focal points of the literature I encountered. So the focus of this work is to do a gender balanced analysis of the role that male students played and the role that female students played in activism. And for this paper, this is just a section of my dissertation. For this paper, I look principally at the concept of masculinity and feminism in student activism and how that is played out. So first of all, I look at certain key aspects of university education which influence student activism. And one of that is enrollment in the university. And going through the archival documents, I realized that enrollment within the university there wasn't any gender parity right from the establishment of the university. University of, at that time it was University College of the Gold Coast, where 90 students were enrolled, 2 were female and 88 were male. And down the years, there has been an increment in terms of percentage of females who have been enrolled, yet as at now, we still haven't been able to achieve gender parity in enrollment. And this is quite influential in activism in the sense that when it comes to electing leaders within the universities, enrollment plays a very key role because women are unable to, first of all, within the SRC portfolio, representation is according to halls. And traditionally, things have changed now, but traditionally, there was only one female hall and 3 male halls for the 3 traditional universities I'm looking at, and then 1 mixed hall. So that would mean that when each hall is sending a representative, you would have lesser females as compared to the males. So that is one aspect of it which contributed to student activism in which the women were not as represented and their voices were not as heard. And so enrollment didn't help the women in terms of their activism. I also look at the role of culture in student activism. And through this, I realized that from colonial time, the way, even in education, the females are trained. I use the Victorian ideology where women are expected to be seen, not heard. And they are trained to be silent participants wherever they find themselves. As a result, in order to be a lady in the context given, then it means that women, the voices of women were unheard. And after independence, this trend still continued. And another aspect of it will be the role that the segregated education system contributed to even enrollment, in the sense that at that time, most of the courses allocated to the females were based around domestic science. And most parents were not too eager to educate their girls. And even those who educated them after the middle level decided that they should stay at home and rather receive the traditional form of training in order to prepare them for marriage. Whilst on the side of the boys, they had more privileges as compared to the women. And even those who had the opportunity to go to the university were quite focused on their education instead of other, what we will call extracurricular activities, because they had a lot of expectation expected of them, and they had to meet up with that expectation. And their own socialization, how they had been nurtured and trained at home. Throughout the interviews, I realized that there are very few women who had gone into leadership positions who, when you find out from their backgrounds, you realize that it's either they come from politically active homes or they are nurtured in the urban areas. So those factors influenced the women who were able to come out and then contribute to activism through leadership or through other forms of activism. So this paper also looks at the role of culture and how the socialization of both males and females influence their role in student activism. And I move on from there to look at the forms of masculinity and feminism when it comes to activism. And with that, I identified that student activism, especially in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, was very violent. There was the use of a lot of violent demonstrations. You can talk about ponding. There was a culture within the universities where anytime somebody offended these students, they will just lift the person up. Most of the halls had ponds in front of them and just dump them in the pond and all that. They beat up people they sought to express their opinions against. there was the smashing of food here and there. So the nature of activism was quite violent, and women are not known to express their opinion as violently as men are known to do. As a result of this, the role that men play in activism is clearly seen, whilst that of women is not too known because it's not as visible as that of the men, and it's not as loud as that of the men. So this paper looks at the other forms of activism which women contributed towards student activism, and interviewing past student leaders and also administrative authorities. One thing that comes out is that when it comes to seeking for change, women were known to do a lot of negotiations as compared to the men. And one professor I interviewed, Professor Kilapa Sawyer, mentioned that anytime he sought to seek for a consensus from students and he couldn't achieve that, he usually tried using the women. And also some past student leaders have also mentioned that whenever you wanted the alloters, you had to pass through the channel of the men. And whenever you wanted a negotiation form or a team that will go for negotiation, they sought for the attention of the women. So that tells me that the forms of activism of the females and the males was not the same. But this is not exclusive. I'm not saying that whenever there were demonstrations, the women did not participate, but their participation was limited as compared to that of the men. So that is another aspect that the paper looks at. And also, I look at the few women who have been able to break through the concepts of student activism, or the perception that student activism is a male-dominated arena. So I look at the contribution of a few women who have been able to break through those channels. And one is a woman who was the first to win the presidency seat of the Mensa Sabah Hall. And one thing that you would observe is that even in leadership, most of the time, the position of the president, the position of the secretary was reserved for the males, and then the position of the treasurer was reserved for the females. And with that, the explanation given is that the women are trusted with money more than the men. So usually they recruit women to be treasurers, whilst they recruit men to be the presidents and the secretaries, because once students come to campus, there are people whom I classify as kingmakers and queenmakers on campus. They are the ones who identify potential student leaders, and sometimes they nurture them and prepare them for the students' leadership positions. So these ones, because of their own socialization and culture, also recruit people according to the said rules I have just described. So women for the treasurer position, and then men for the secretary and the president position. So the first time we had a female SRC president in Ghana was in 2008. And then even for a NUC's president, we haven't yet had one. So that tells us that we still have a long way to go. So this paper moves on to look at the different levels of representation or gendered activism. I look at it from the local level, that is the JCR, the faculty and the other associational leadership level, then the institutional leadership, that is the SRC, the one I just described, and then the NUCs, that's the National Union of Ghana Students, that's the national representation of students. And at all these three levels, I realized that there wasn't any sensitive gender policy which helped to shape a more equal roles for the men and the women when it came to leadership positions. And now what has become the norm, which is different from what
Eugenia, I'm sorry to interrupt. Eugenia, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you should wrap up so we hear from the discussants.
Okay, so what has changed now is that usually in vying for the positions, the men opt for the president position, they pick a female to be the vice president position, and then all the others battle for the rest of the position. So to conclude, I state that education is the single most important factor when it comes to transformation of political roles for both men and women in Ghana. And when it comes to student activism, there has been some form of transformation, but this transformation has been quite slow and it hasn't been forthcoming. And also, the essence of this paper is to analyze whether through student activism, there can be parity in our political landscape, because Ghana is still far off from even the 30% quota we have given ourselves. So the argument is, if students from the university are able to achieve gender parity in leadership and also in activism, then it becomes easier for the national landscape to also take over and then achieve that gender parity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eugenia. I'm going to turn it over to Emmanuel to give his comments. Sorry, we're not hearing you. The standard Zoom.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the APCG group for inviting me to be a discussant, and to Amanda for setting all of this up. And thank you to Eugenia for sharing her paper. I enjoyed reading the paper, and I did write up my comments, so I'll be reading, but try to speak as if I'm having a conversation with you, which is the case. I enjoyed reading the paper. The study of African student activism seems to have had its heyday by the early 2000s. And since then, we've had sporadic, although important, scholarship on it here and there. So it is refreshing to see Eugenia revisit the history of Ghanaian student activism from an important yet hardly explored perspective, which is gender. The paper, as she did in her summary, seeks to interpret student activism in Ghana from the early 1960s to 2008, or more recent times, as a gendered phenomenon or experience. Student activism, the paper notes, has privileged male voices. The scholarly literature is either silent on the gendered nature of student activism or treat female students as insignificant players in this activism. The paper then argues that gender inequality in Ghanaian universities accounts for the near absence of women in student activism, and hence the silence in the literature. The paper also has a sub-argument about student activism contributing to social change, which I may return to if I have the time or the opportunity. I'm not going to go through a summary since we've all read the paper, but my comments will relate mostly to the organization of the paper, and it was good to know that this comes from a dissertation, but I'll speak to the organization of the paper and also the historical content. This paper's original approach to student activism as the existing literature on Ghana and to Africa or the continent to a large extent hardly discusses gender. Some of the literature discuss student activism in relation to class or class struggle, but hardly in terms of gender. The tendency has been for the published scholarship not to dwell on or quietly accept as natural, and therefore not requiring any further analysis, male dominance of student movement. But why do male students dominate student movements and in the archival record? To what extent have female students been involved in activism? In what ways and under what conditions and circumstances? To what extent are the spaces from which this activism issues, that is the higher education institutions, gendered? What have been the tactics, strategies, and the nature of student activism? And how have these privileged male participation and discouraged women from full involvement in student activism and movements on the continent? These are the questions that Eugenia's paper, as I read it, directly and indirectly seek to explore. And it is in these respects that the original contribution of the paper lies. Here, and this is my first critical comment, given that this is the part of the paper that is original, I think the paper needs a richer invocation or discussion of the Ghanaian and African literature in terms of its inadequate treatment of gender, so as to draw more attention to the originality of the paper's approach to student activism and therefore its contribution. And from your comments, it seems to me you have a lot more than we read in the paper as sent to us. The division of the periods of student activism into 3 phases is a sound choice. However, I have a couple of comments or questions to ask. So for instance, why do you start from 1960 or 1961? It's not clear to me which year you're using, but why that beginning year? I think we need some explanation for that start point. 2, in terms of the labeling of the 3rd period, you refer to it as the political phase. So you have the budding phase of student activism from 1960 to 1972, the revolutionary phase from 1972 to 1992, and then the political phase from 1992 to 2008 or to more recent times. And my question there is, or my comment there is that the reference to the 3rd phase as the political phase does not really distinguish it from the other phases, because student activism in all the 3 phases was really political. So what is it you need as labels go? You need something more identifying of that 3rd phase. My next comment has to do with the organization of the paper. It seems to me that the second part of the paper, that is the part where you discuss theories and a broad set of factors that have fostered gender inequality in the universities and therefore have gendered student activism, should actually come up in the paper. It seems to me that you should lay out these factors and theories in the first part of the paper. And then in the second part of the paper, you provide narration and analysis of the different phases and show how these factors, either in their combined effect or separately, have gendered student activism. As the paper stands, we get some overview of student activism in the 3 phases without any sense at all of how gendered student activism was, and then later read about the factors that contributed to gender inequality in the universities. Going along with the reorganization of the paper is also the need for a bit more reconstruction of the details of student activism in the 3 phases. And here I'm speaking as a historian. The secondary literature, some of which you've referenced in the paper, already provides an overview of student activism, in fact, in more detail. So in this paper, originality will lie in revisiting the periods and identifying and offering what I'll call a thick description, to borrow the term from anthropology and other social sciences, as it were, of student activism, which foregrounds how gender was in play. To illustrate my point, your paper gives a brief overview of student opposition to the military regimes of the 1970s, which is a traditional account we get in the published works. Later on in the paper, when you discuss the factors for gender inequality, you tell of an incident in September 1977, when students of Volta Hall, the all-female residential hall of the University of Ghana, decided not to join their fellow students in boycotting exams, which was one of the strategies decided by the student government of the university in their impasse with the then military regime. In that incident, we see female students seeking to exercise a voice in the activism of the period, but it also shows that female students were the object of apprehension among male activists as to their participation in the ongoing conflict with government. This is gender in play, and an example of the gender dimensions we don't get from the existing literature. Reorganizing your paper and including this incident in a thick description of the 1970s activism will help establish the originality of the paper. So, to frame it as a set of questions: where is gender in the student activism of the 1960s against Nkrumah, in the early 70s against the Buzi administration, and in the period after? What were or have been the gender implications of the dominant developments you have identified for the period from 1992 to recent times? What has been the gender impact of the political partisanship that has divided student activist front from the 1990s onwards? You highlight these in the paper, but I think you need some deeper analysis to really foreground what gender or the role of gender in all of these periods of student activism. Another comment, you hint at some female students aspiring to or holding leadership positions in a few places in the paper, but there's hardly any discussion of these women who would be remarkable given that student activism was male dominated. So you say, for instance, that due to certain developments in the 1970s, especially around the declaration of the UN Declaration of the Decade for Women, 75 to 85, these occurrences and developments led to a gradual awakening of desires for gender equality and of women seeking to play active roles in activism as did their male counterparts. But you provide no empirical evidence of the female students who sought to play active roles in student activism. Interestingly, you talked to, I believe you interviewed Techua Menu, who was one of the female activists of the period. And I think there's a lot more that you can get from her. On this, a line of inquiry to pursue would be to find out about the female students, mostly on the left, who established themselves as activists in the late 1970s and early 80s, and initiated the founding of a few women's organizations, including the 31st December Women's Movement by 1982. These student activists attached the organization to the Rollins School because they saw it as an opportunity to push for wider social change in Ghana, especially in terms of gender relations. Nana Edward Rawlins's wife will subsequently become chair of the organization and therefore eclipsed these women. But the work that the activists did before she took over is something worthy of pursuit. And here Techua Men is a person to speak to, but also Joji Chikata, the director of the Institute of African Studies, who was one of the activists. And she has a publication. I've provided it in the footnote for you that you should, I think, read. As an aside, the claim that gender equality as a concept was set in motion in Ghana, I think needs to be more nuanced or out-contested, but that is beside the point. We can talk more about that. Your overview is also silent about some key developments. So one of them, for instance, has to do with how in the 1960s, as a result of the contentions with the Nkrumah government, student activism constructed itself as a site of advocacy for the common man in Ghana. So that students really didn't think that they were speaking about student welfare, but really they are spokespersons for national causes. It is this notion that newer generations of student activists will carry on subsequently. So in their opposition to the Buzi government's introduction of the loan scheme, for instance, the student argument was predicated on the fact that higher education was a public good, and that by introducing the loan scheme and other measures, it was privatizing it, and that will, move it out of the hands of the ordinary person. It was the same attitude that informed their activism around the declaration of assets and so on. So I think you need to highlight this. Another development, and this I'm sort of moving forward, has to do with activism in the third phase. You talk about the push for Ghana's return to democracy, but also the political partisanship that divided the student front. But one of the key developments of the period was the activism that emerged around neoliberal reforms, specifically in education. So IMF pressure for Ghana to introduce cost sharing in university education. And between 1998 and early 2000, I know something about this because I was the student at the University of Ghana at the time. a lot of activism in opposition to government. And there were gender dimensions to that. I remember one incident when the students went to the seat of the then government, the Osu Castle, to present a petition to Jerry John Rawlings, and the police ended up beating the students. Much national outrage because there were scenes of police officers manhandling female students, including the then Women's Commissioner of NUCS or the Legon SRC. I think you can bring some gender analysis to this activism, but it is completely absent in your paper. Amanda, how am I doing? Do I still have some time?
Maybe 1 more minute.
1 more minute, okay. Perhaps my final comment would be about the social change. It needs to be developed a bit more in the paper. How exactly are you thinking of social change, or what do you mean by it? I get the impression that by social change, you're referring to how students have been catalysts or been involved in the various political changes and political reforms in Ghanaian history. But I want to push you to perhaps think of it in a wider sense. And in this respect, I borrowed the idea of Paulo or Pascal Bianchini has written on student activism in Francophone Africa, and he talks about the generative function. And there are 2 dimensions to this. How student activism was a site where future politicians cut their teeth. And so you get a lot of Ghanaian politicians today who actually emerge out of student activism, but also how student activism is tied to various organizations that emerge. So think of the Ghanaian CSOs that we have today. Many of them have sort of personnel that come out of the student activism period. And I think in these ways, you can expand on the point about social change and so on and so forth. There are minor things to speak about, but I'll do so. I'll send you what I've written up for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are excellent comments. Before we ask Eugenia to respond to them, we'll now hear from Kristin as well.
All right. So yeah, let me first just echo the thanks to Amanda for organizing and also for the audience members for attending. And I really enjoyed this paper. So it was a great opportunity. It was easy to read and I really thought it would make a really great contribution. So I have a few comments that I'll make. Some of them actually dovetail a little bit what has been said before. So maybe I'll first start off with a comment of, I thought that it could be neat if you could track down more information on the growth of the female student body in universities. So at one point you give us a snapshot in time of just a few different years. But I thought, well, gosh, if possible, and obviously everything's, tough right now because of the pandemic and, it's tough to do the field work, but I wonder if it would be possible to be able to access records at 1 or 2 of the most prominent universities and sort of get a year-by-year snapshot in the gender balance in the student body. And that would be a real contribution to just have it recorded. How did the student body change over time with the gender ratio? And likewise, I thought it would be interesting, if possible, to track down, just how many, like year by year, how many leadership positions were held by women. And maybe this would evolve over time. Maybe in the very beginning, all of the student government positions would be held by males, but then over time we could see some progression, or maybe not. And maybe there's other student clubs where that could be documented as well and found using, some archival kind of digging. I was also kind of curious if there were any women's groups that emerged. So it could be that, some of the women who enter the university see, oh, geez, like these are really male-dominated clubs. In order to display leadership, we have to go off and create our own women's organization. So I thought that might be an outlet, where women said, well, why fight the uphill battle, you know, to be active in these existing institutions, let's form our own institution. So I thought that could be potentially neat. You know, when were those institutions founded? How did they grow? How many members did they have? Maybe some archival digging would yield, you know, some interesting facts to include. My second point relates to maybe defining a little bit more clearly whether it's the case that female students were indeed active, but it went unrecorded in academic work or in news media, or if it's the case that female students were less active because of the many factors that you mentioned, or maybe both. But I thought that if, you know, there's a significant underreporting of what female students were doing, it would be a nice opportunity for you to give voice to that. And maybe, if possible, tracking down, you know, leaders of women's clubs or women who were treasurers and asking them, oh, you know, what are the unsung things that women were doing that weren't recorded? If possible, to contact those people, that would be really interesting to hear more about. Like you mentioned, that women often would play a role in negotiations. So what did they do? What were these unsung things? Women maybe played support roles. What were those roles? And just gaining more detail about that if possible. I also had the comment about candidacy. So I was really interested to know if it was possible to make a statement about, well, hey, like a lot of political candidates find their roots, or, you know, ramp up their skills to run for office through student government in universities. And this is such an important pipeline. Is it the case that when women are precluded from student government positions, that precludes women from going on to being candidates for political office in Ghana? So in other words, there might be a bottlenecking. The pipeline of women candidates for office is compromised from gatekeeping over student government positions in particular. And maybe it might be interesting to end the piece with some prescriptive suggestions. Is it the case that university student government should make sure to include women? Should there be affirmative action in some way? Should there be other opportunities for women to be groomed as leaders through other alternative forums if it's, you know, too difficult within the existing forums? Let's see, I think just a couple more comments. I was curious about what university instructors or university leadership did about gender inequality, if anything. So we hear a lot about the halls and the students themselves, but I wonder if, you know, professors or the administration, you know, had any goals at any point to improve gender inequality, or if they said, well, gosh, I really wanted to do that, but I came up against XYZ barriers, like the, you know, government funders said, you know, don't prioritize building another women's hall because they're not going to get jobs or something like that. And then I thought that it might be interesting to connect your work, maybe in a final section, to other studies of gender bias in student activism in other countries, or maybe to other studies of gender bias in non-student activism spheres in Ghana. So how does this kind of speak, you know, citing other literature on gender, like for example, with the, yeah, like other women's movements in Ghana, how does it relate, if at all? And it sort of reminded me a little bit, I don't know that you'd want to go in this direction, but it reminded me a little bit of a faculty member here at Vanderbilt, Shatima Threadcraft's work on the Black Lives Matter movement. And she sort of argues that oftentimes in the media, men are glorified in the context of this movement, and men are, you know, cast as martyrs, but then violence against women is shamed and isn't reported in the media, in part because of gender norms about, you know, oh, violence against women is, you know, shameful. Sometimes it includes sexual violence, but it's very prevalent among police. And so I think there is larger notions in the literature that men are disproportionately glorified for what they're doing versus women. So maybe tying into that kind of bigger picture literature might be interesting. So I think I'll stop there and let the audience chime in and let Eugenia chime in. But thanks again for the opportunity to read this nice and fascinating work.
Thanks, Kristin. Eugenia, would you prefer to respond to some of those comments, or do you want to take questions from other people as well? We have about 15 minutes.
Yeah, let me respond.
Okay.
So first of all, to Professor Asiedu-Acquah, a lot of comments. Thank you so much, and they were quite constructive. Your first question in relation to the year, the commencement year. The commencement year is 1961, and the reason for choosing 1961 is the start year focuses on when the first two universities gained autonomy. That's University of Ghana and then the Kwame University of Science and Technology gained autonomy from the University of London. So that's the reason, the main reason why I chose 1961. Though in my dissertation, I briefly look at the introduction of higher education in Ghana, and then how student activism played in when it comes to the independence struggle, and even post-independence in Nkrumah years between 1957 and 1960. But that one is done just briefly. So that is it. And the reason why I use the term political faith, I understand the concern you are raising, but my reason is that in the previous phases, the burden phase as well as the active phase or the revolutionary phase, students were political, but the student front was not divided politically. Students had their own political affiliation, but political parties at that time did not play a dominant role in Ghana's history. So those students had their own affiliation. The affiliation did not visibly divide the student front as was done after 1992. So that's the reason why I use the term political phase, but I can still go back and then rephrase it if it's not too appropriate. And then all the others are, I would have to go back and then take a relook at the paper again. And then to the comments of Kristin, talking about doing a year-by-year snapshot. I've actually done that in my dissertation. I didn't bring it in the paper because it would have made it a little too lengthy. I wanted to give just a summary. That's why I gave the percentage figures. So if you go into the dissertation, you realize that I do a gender year-by-year analysis of the enrollment figures, and then I'm able to trace the changing trend when it comes to the percentages of females and males. So as it stands at the beginning in 1948, it was 2%. And then by 2008, the percentage had increased for some of the universities such as UCC, that's University of Cape Coast, and then for University of Ghana, it had increased to about 45%. But in Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, we have about 34% for the females and then the rest for the males. So it varies, it's not static, but generally there has been a great improvement when it comes to enrollment. And then talking about looking at women groups, I have actually looked at some in the dissertation. I didn't bring it here, but I guess I can introduce some. And as Professor Asiedu-Acquah said, I can also, I've actually spoken to Professor Sewanee and also Professor Eugenia. They were one of the main people who spearheaded these Marxist groups and female groups at that time. So I've actually spoken to them, and they do talk about some of the groups that existed, and afterwards, through that, they were able to establish the 31st December Women's Movement. And as you said, later on, the former First Lady took over the organization. So that is in the dissertation, though it's not in the paper. So I'll find a way of chipping it in here and there. And also, students, whether the female students were active or less active or both, it's dependent on it's individual, let me put it that way. There were some active people, but generally, especially in the 60s and 70s, we would generally say that the women were inactive, though there were a few individuals who were quite vocal and who moved with the men and made sure that the female voices were heard. So at that time, collectively, they were not active. Then moving into the late 70s, the 80s, then the numbers of women participating in activism began to increase. So that increase is what I try to look at, or the changes which has occurred in not just leadership, but also in participation in all forms of activism. So it's a little bit of both. There's some form of activism on the high note, and then there are times where it's on the low note. So it's a combination of both. And also asking about the role of the administration to improve gender equality. Some efforts have been made in times past, and in my dissertation, I mentioned that one of the key factors which led to did not aid in enrollment of females was that admission was tied to getting an opportunity to be accommodated within the university. So admissions were tied to accommodation. And because of that, at that time, traditionally, the women had only one hall, and later they added an annex of a male hall. So once that accommodation slots were filled, then no matter how qualified you were, you didn't have access to the university. And eventually that has changed over time. So currently, if you look at all the universities, almost all the halls are either mixed or, yes, most of them are mixed. So with that, an opportunity was given for an expanded enrollment. And also eventually the policy on everybody being accommodated within the campus also changed. So we had the on-campus and then the off-campus. And once that policy was also brought in, then it meant that greater numbers of women as well as men could be enrolled in the university. And currently we have some policies which also aid in the admission of women, where sometimes the aggregate used to admit, sometimes for the women, they can let it go a little bit further as compared to the men. So all of these factors have aided in increasing the enrollment of women as compared to men. Yes, so that's it. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we have 8 minutes. I think maybe if there are questions from others, we could take them all together. So at least Eugenia gets those questions, even if she's not able to respond to them today. So if anybody has a question, yeah, Alicia, go ahead.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you so much for what was a fantastic paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and the comments from the discussants were absolutely fantastic. Kind of as we've been having this discussion, I've been really thinking about what you want to do with this paper. I know it's part of your dissertation, but I'm wondering, you know, what your goals are for the paper in terms of it being a standalone paper and in terms of publication, because certainly as we're going through and talking about this, I can almost see two papers emerging from this. One being this more historical paper, which really interrogates, you know, the gaps in the existing literature on student activism, as Emmanuel has pointed out, and, you know, the contributions that you're making, but then also potentially another paper which really examines the implications for social change and political activism, and really maybe examines, what you've said that you have some of this data about the increase in women's representation in women's organizations, and then the implications for politics and social change more broadly. And I could almost see these as being two kind of standalone papers, but would love to hear what your thoughts are and what you want to do with this work. But thank you so much.
I see Andreas also has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Eugenia. It was a fantastic read and extremely interesting, and I learned a lot. So I'm already very happy for this. And also the discussion was great. So a bit to what Alicia was saying as well. So if we really nail down this question on, is it a case that through student activism, women will start to organize themselves and then will be more politically active for the rest of their lives? I find an interesting question, perhaps not in this paper, but perhaps in the dissertation, could be to take all the data from the Afrobarometer, for instance, and look at the correlation between having a university education for men and women over time. Not over time when the different surveys are, but over time in terms of when people are born. So you could look at different cohorts of women, you could connect it to these different phases that you're discussing of student activism and how gendered that is. And you can try to see if you find that like long run effect of men's and women's political participation in the Afrobarometer, which would be a large survey where you would be able to actually do that. So also to Kristin's point, I think that I'm a data guy, but even for everyone, I think some data here would be interesting. I was really glad to hear that you had described these gender ratios in cohorts and so on in other chapters, and that's really good. But I think so. Also, again, looking at other data that is freely available, like the demographic and health surveys, for instance, could help to see how the gender ratios have increased across cohorts in men's higher education and women's higher education, which is survey data that is freely available and exists for many, many women from different cohorts. So if you could post your email in the chat, I could send you some other comments I have as well, since we don't have that much time. But I think this was fantastic, and looking forward to reading your future work.
Thank you, Andreas. Alex? I'll let Alex ask this question, and then Eugenia, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I found this to be a really interesting paper, and I think it rang true with a lot of what I've heard from friends who are involved in student activism in contexts from like the UK to Kenya to South Africa, that there is this kind of very kind of intense thing that often involves a lot of very gendered dynamics. And I was kind of struck by the initial definition of student activism, which I thought kind of on first read was quite broad, right? It's just sort of achieving any goal. And then when I started thinking about it, I realized that actually, yes, you know, there are, like, student activism is broad. It can go from anything from critiquing neoliberalism as you go through down to specific national policies to international policies, and then kind of very generic university specific policies around fees and exams that you kind of discuss. And I was wondering, you kind of get at this a little bit in the paper, whether there's sort of differential access and differential opportunities for women to kind of move in depending on the topic, right? Are there some topics that are kind of more along the kind of political pipeline that people have talked about because national parties have often tapped into these student activist groups that are more exclusive along gender lines? Are there some specific topics that even kind of patriarchal student leaders are kind of more willing to concede? And you talk a little bit about the treasury position, but I'm thinking more about the specific lines of activism that people are working on. So kind of breaking that broad definition down into kind of the typology might be helpful in terms of thinking about But as I said, it was a really good paper. And then last, just to plug one of Lindsay and my colleagues, Gender and Political Participation Working Group. I'll send you the link through the chat, but they're kind of workshopping papers on gender. So might be a good thing to try and sign up for as well.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, Eugenia, we have 2 minutes if you want to respond to any of those or say anything else before we wrap up.
Okay, so thank you for your comment. As to the goal of the paper, yes, I do wish to publish after this. The goal is just to publish and also to provide information out there for everybody to know what is in existence. And then, Andreas, to be frank, I couldn't hear much of your comments. There was a little bit of noise here and there, so I'm really sorry I couldn't really hear much. And then to the last comment, talking about differential access and opportunities. I would say that formally, the different genders were not treated differently. When you look through the students' constitutions and all that, it was ungendered. All positions were accessible to all. All opportunities were available for all students. When it comes to enrollment at that time, it was ungendered. So there was the quota for enrollment was not maybe male this, female that. It was ungendered. However, how the different genders took advantage of the available opportunities was dependent on the different circumstances available to them. Those are some of the circumstances I was talking about, that even when it comes to enrollment, culture, socialization, and all that comes in. And in my dissertation, I even look at the role of other factors such as child fostering and all that when it comes to the education of women. So it was easier for parents to send their boys to school than it was for them to send their girls to school, though that has changed pretty much now. Now it's no longer like that, but formally it was like that. It was a big deal to take a boy to school. And when you talk to people, you realize that you would have the woman in the family actually working to pay for the education of one man in the family. So because of that, he would definitely advance while the others wouldn't. And when it comes to leadership positions, it was the same thing. It was ungendered. Anybody could go for any position, but it had become more or less like a norm, a practice which had come to stay, that once, though there were few cases where you had women trying to vie for other positions but failed, and then you had men to vie for the treasurer positions. Sometimes they were successful, other times they were not. So most of the time, in terms of policy was ungendered. However, the implication of those policies was different for each gender. Thank you.
All right.
And so I want to say thank you to all of you, to Professor Asiedu-Acquah as well as to Kristin. I want to say thank you for your very constructive criticism. I loved it. And to all the participants, I say thank you for the opportunity. And to you as well, Amanda, I say thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your work with us. I thought this was a great conversation. I would encourage people that didn't have a chance to ask question or have their feedback shared to email. Eugenia, I've put her email address in the chat. If you miss it, you can send me an email and I'll share that. I also want to thank Emmanuel and Kristin for reading the paper so carefully and giving such great comments. And for everybody else, thank you for joining, and please look out for emails about future sessions. Have a great day.